Morning.
New Bern and Craven County have some of the most remarkable stories involving African Americans in the nation. In fact, John Hope Franklin, who was arguably the most important African American historian of the second half of the 20th century, once told me that the story in New Bern is unique, that there really is not another one like it in the nation. These stories go back to the end of the 17th and into the 18th centuries, on through the 19th and of course the 20th century. Among those stories, though, among the most interesting is of course the story of the Trent River Settlement and James City. And we are fortunate to have with us here today at the Crockett-Miller Slave Quarters in James City, Ben Watford, who is the president of the James City Historical Society and a historian who has done much research on this area. And Ben, we're so pleased to be here with you and grateful that you're willing to talk with us about all that there is to see here and all it represents in our history.
It's a pleasure to be here. The Trent River Settlement was important in the history of James City. The original settlement. The slave quarters that you see behind you is one of the last freestanding slave quarters in the state of North Carolina, and it was refurbished by the James City Historical Society. We've just completed the structure, and it represents the Trent River Settlement and the former slaves who are buried here at the Far Cemetery.
I designed the base for the pedestal for the monument, and we had that put here in 2003. And the caption reads, erected under the auspices of the James City Historical Society in the year of our Lord 2003 to commemorate the freedmen and slaves buried here at the Far Cemetery. And the caption under that is from Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, awake to ecstasy the living lyre. And I thought that was appropriate. Many of the residents who live in James City, the black residents, have relatives who are buried here. But you know, after 6 or 7, 8 generations, no one comes back to a grave site to visit anything of that nature. So someone has to preserve it. We don't do anything basically to the cemetery itself. We just leave it as it is because there's nothing there but graves. There are no monuments, no tombstones, or anything of that nature to mark the places where the individuals are buried there. The only marker is this monument that the James City Historical Society put up.
If you're going to enslave an individual, you have to first dehumanize them. You can't enslave another human being. So what they would, since the animals were buried without tombstones because they weren't human, slaves were not allowed to have tombstones. So what they would do is put trinkets on and jugs on the graves of the loved ones to mark the grave site. So in putting the jugs on, some potter got the idea of putting faces on the jug. And since they're coming from Africa, they had accepted Christianity and the belief in the devil and that sort of thing. So the idea was that the uglier the face, the better, because it would scare the devil away and your soul could go to heaven. And these jugs like this were placed typically on the graves of slaves during that period. I make a lot of those. I'm basically a potter these days.
I dare say there would be 10,000 blacks in the United States if it were not for slavery. We would not be here because of immigration laws and that sort of thing. So it's much like, in some ways, slavery had an economic base. And it's probably one of the oldest institutions that man has encountered. The slavery has been around since the beginning of time. The first question I was asked when we started to preserve the slave quarters was, why would a black man want to preserve a slave quarters? And basically what I had to do was explain to people that it's a part of history. And if you look at the Jews, they were enslaved under the Pharaohs more than 2,000 years ago, and they still celebrate it each year. It's not something we want to forget. To forget history is to repeat it. So the reconstruction of the slave quarters was a special project for me, and it meant that we were preserving the history of the blacks in the United States. It's something we don't want to forget. If you forget history, then you have a tendency to repeat it. And you don't want to see that episode in American history ever repeated again. Now we have one other thing here that's of interest to me, and that's this outhouse.
Yeah.
At the turn of the century. In fact, we used one of these when I was a kid growing up. We never had indoor plumbing, electricity, or anything of that nature. No heating system. We used wood stoves, and that's the way you grew up in North Carolina during the 1930s, prior to 1930. In 1840, when this was built, it cost about $50 to build it. We put $175,000 into the restoration of this, and all that money was raised by writing grants to the various nonprofit foundations in the state of North Carolina. Z. Smith gave us $60,000. The Kellenberger Foundation gave us $22,000. Weyerhaeuser gave us $10,000. Catherine Bryan Price Family Fund gave us $10,000. And many other nonprofit organizations in the state of North Carolina contributed to this slave quarters. And they were willing to help us preserve this. The reason it cost so much to restore was because we had the architect, Stevens and Francis from New Bern, oversee the reconstruction of the project to make sure that we used the correct materials. If you look at the steps over here, the steps are built without nails. They're built with just pegs, the way steps were built during that period. These are wood pegs, are the only thing that will hold the steps in place. It's almost as if they took the slave quarters out of a mold. All the slave quarters in the state of North Carolina and in other states were built on this same pattern. If you go online, you can see slave quarters in Louisiana that look almost identical to the slave quarters that you see here. Now, we made very few concessions on this with the materials. All the materials are period materials. Much of the beams like this are beams that were put on when the structure was originally built. Now, much of this we had to fill in with epoxy because the worms had eaten through this, so all of that had to be done. It doesn't appear to be, but it's a two-story structure. In the loft is where they slept, and in the bottom rooms are where they just came in to eat or something of that nature. Actually, if you were a slave, you spent very little time inside anyway, maybe 6 or 7 hours to sleep, and then you were up in the morning going out to work and coming back late at night. So it was very little usage as far as the home service was concerned or anything of that nature. Now, if you come inside for a minute. Now, the original intent was to put in the furniture that was typical of the slave quarters during that period. But that furniture was so sparse, it would be nothing but a table, a chair, and so what we decided to do was put up the old tools that were used during that period. And all of these tools came from an antique shop that my brother ran in Hertford County. And we have items like this plow shaft, which was made totally in a blacksmith shop. You can see the indentations from his hammer, where he struck this with his hammer to form the plow shaft. All of these tools are period tools that were used during that period.
When you don't want the mule looking side to side. He's a very curious animal. So when you put blinders on him like this with the bit in his mouth, and he can't look from side to side, he can only look straight ahead. Yeah, I can even visualize the mule's head coming through here.
This is just a picture gallery, and we have pictures here of the
For example, this picture shows what the slave quarters looked like when we picked it up. You can see the metal roof, the asbestos shingles. It was in total disrepair. I mean, it was a structure that someone would have said no one would be able to ever repair that. In fact, I thought I could come out and take the shingles off myself, but the architect wouldn't allow that. We had to hire a company to come and remove the asbestos shingles. This is a picture of Horace James. He was the first superintendent of Negro Affairs under Burnside in about 1863, 1864. And he was basically responsible for the Trent River settlement, which housed the blacks. You don't know about that, but pine straw. When we were kids growing up, our mattresses were made with pine straw, and you just take the pine straw and put it in between the cloth, and you put it on the bed just like a mattress. So or you use some grass or something of that nature. But basically, what we used when we were kids growing up was pine straw, and that was our mattress, and you slept on it. It was a little bit lumpy, but it was a mattress anyway. At any rate. Interesting that things are so different today than they were during the 1930s. My parents had 15 kids, and I was number 12. And it wasn't, I didn't realize how poor we were until I really grew up. We had everything, had all of our needs. We had a big garden, big farm, and we raised whatever we needed, and it was just a pleasant life. It wasn't bad at all. I never realized how poor we were until I started school, and then other kids were wearing shoes. And a typical day was someone picked you up in a truck and you went to a field to pick cotton. I could never pick 100 pounds a day, and cotton at that time sold for a penny a pound. I would make about probably 70 cents a day, something like that. But 70 cents a day during that period was a lot of money. It was just something to do. It was just a job. You looked at it as it wasn't something you didn't want to do. It's something you wanted to do because you could make 70 cents, and there was a lot of money. 70 cents would feed my family my parents' family for a week. Probably the most popular picture in this area is this one. This shows the slaves coming in with the Union troops as they came into New Bern. All the slaves flocked under the banner of the Union troops because they were considered contraband, because the fugitive slave law stated that you had to get as far away as Canada to be free. So when Burnside captured New Bern, all the slaves flocked to his banner and basically started the Trent River settlement. And
Ben, I want to thank you so much for hosting us here today, and I know that if people would like to learn more in depth, there's the opportunity to take a tour, and I think the number that you can call and reach Ben is on the screen now. And so Ben, would you like to give us that number once again, just orally?
638-8536, 252-638-8536.
And I can assure you that you will have a very, very interesting tour if you are with Ben Watford. And we are very grateful to him for showing us around today. And we thank you for joining us for another episode of the NEWBERNIAN. There's so many wonderful stories in New Bern's history, and we want to explore as many of those as we can. And we are grateful every time you join us to learn a little bit more about this wonderful place where we live.